All right, everyone, should we get started? We've got three great speakers today. So yeah, welcome first of all to the SHW Cross Team Seminar. So this is our first of this new term. So yeah, if anyone else wants to present in the upcoming few months, we have a seminar first Tuesday of every month, and we're constantly looking for people. So approach us before we approach you. So yeah, we've got three great speakers, like I said today. We're going to have 12 minutes each for presentation and then around 5 minutes for questions each. And we'll start off with Maria.
Yeah, hi everyone, thanks so much for having me today. My name is Maria Bissett. I'm technically in the School of Cardiovascular Metabolic Health, but I'm part of the Social Scientists and Health group. So I'm very, you might see me in this building quite a lot actually. So today I'm going to talk a wee bit about the Clyde Metro project, which is a project focusing on the integration of mass transit or public transport and active travel, so cycling, walking and wheeling. So what is the Clyde Metro? So it's actually a partnership amongst Glasgow City Council, Strathclyde Partnership for Transport and Transport Scotland. So this is a new, key sustainable mass transit project in line with Glasgow and Scotland's sustainable development goals to reduce emissions and reach net zero. So they've got a huge long list of a definition on the website. But among other things, it is a fully integrated mass transit public transport system, which could include a variety of modes, so rail, buses, as well as active travel. A multi-billion-pound long-term investment programme, so it's anticipated it's going to take at least the next 30 years to really reach its conclusion. But from the health and wellbeing perspective, it's anticipated to help tackle social exclusion by improving access to healthcare, education, employment opportunities, especially reaching some of the more underserved areas. So this is a kind of hypothetical map. It's not the routes or anything like that, but it's an idea of what the Clyde Metro could look like, implementing more of these kind of integrated nodes, kind of similar to Partick, if you think of the bus, subway and trains all congregating at that point. So could we integrate maybe more nodes like that, potentially a new light rail line? But as you can see, it's not just Glasgow city centre, it goes all the way up to West Dunbartonshire, North Lanarkshire, East Renfrewshire, South Lanarkshire. So it's the 8 immediate council areas. So I'm going to say Glasgow City Region a lot, and that's basically the kind of economic area of these 8 councils. So this project is funded by Gallant. I don't know if anyone's part of Gallant or knows of it, which is a partnership between the University of Glasgow and Glasgow City Council to develop Glasgow into a living lab, looking at new sustainable solutions to climate change. So I'm part of a kind of subgroup of the active travel team, where we're looking to improve health, well-being, social connectedness, air quality, and reduce car journeys by promoting cycling, wheeling and walking. So the kind of overlap between active travel, but also public transport and how you can get to and from public transport means it's aligned quite nicely with Clyde Metro's goals. So we've been working with Glasgow City Council's Clyde Metro team to kind of develop this project. The main aim is to inform their plans to support people to engage in active travel and use the Clyde Metro, whatever that might look like. We're doing it in a few components. Component 1 is a rapid review of published literature. So we're looking at what cities have successfully planned and implemented an integrated mass transit system and what Glasgow can learn. We also want to look at how other cities have integrated active travel, cycling and walking and wheeling with mass transit to enable safe and multimodal journeys. And component 2 has involved some photo-elicitation interviews, so we're actually speaking to the public. Again, this is quite a small study, so we're just looking at 20 to 40 people. So we're looking to explore the perceived facilitators and barriers to engagement in sustainable travel. So again, public transport is the main focus, but looking at walking and cycling and how that comes into it. But we're specifically wanting to speak to maybe underrepresented population subgroups. So maybe people who would face additional barriers to public transport use. So both of these components are kind of in progress, so I'm just going to share some preliminary findings with you today, but I'll start with an overview of the rapid review. And all the photos in the presentation are ones taken by participants in the photo elicitation interviews as well. So we have searched 4 research databases, including Web of Science, TRID, which is a public transport-based database, Scopus and Embase to kind of get those more health-related findings and benefits. We've kept the search terms kind of more broad, looking at topics of mass transit and active travel, but then specifically looking at case studies or qualitative research. Limited search to English language, published literature. But we wanted to focus more on stakeholder perspectives because actually there's quite a lot of reviews on what the public think about using public transport. So we're trying to kind of keep that focus. But again, it's a rapid review. So we kind of worked with Clyde Metro to narrow it down a bit. We're focusing more on OECD countries that are maybe more comparable to Glasgow, generally similar climates, and 2 key priorities. So the integration of 2 or more modes, specifically focusing on that integration aspect. And the integration of active and public transport. So we started with 6,000 studies, and we've now narrowed it down to 28 for extraction. Again, that's kind of having gone back and forth working with Clyde Metro to review their priorities. The majority have perhaps unsurprisingly come from Germany, Scandinavia, Austria and Australia. Although less comparable climate in Australia. Copenhagen was the most common city, which I think is probably unsurprising if anyone's been there. They've got quite obvious cycle routes, active travel, good metro, good public transport systems. Most have used case studies or policy analysis. We actually found that there was, particularly in public transport literature, the standards that we maybe have in health publishing haven't matched. So there's not been so many direct quotes. But still, we've got a lot of information on integrating cycling and public transport policies, planning and infrastructure. So just a few emerging themes. Again, this is very early stages of analysis. But one thing that seems to be really important in integration specifically is that it happens at all levels, specifically at government and organisational level. For example, this is an example from Copenhagen in Denmark, where is a good example, and even they're saying the question of who owns the responsibility for creating a high level of service for cyclists at public transport stations is actually difficult to answer. So public transport and active travel tend to happen in a bit of a vacuum, and it's about can you build that planning into the in from the get-go. And then similarly, this is an example from Stockholm. There's different departments for transport and urban planning. There's also different political heads for each department. So you're battling against different interests and needs. So how can you try and make it this more cohesive picture of all the benefits of public transport and active travel can bring? Another is just the quality and the quantity of integrated infrastructure. So Freiburg in Germany is one of the better examples of good active travel integrated infrastructure. So they offer secure sheltered parking for 1,000 bikes, bike rental, bike repair, travel advice and bike shipment at their main train station, among other benefits. But again, that needs to be adequately planned and not an afterthought. So an example from Oslo, somebody's just said 1,000 bike parking spaces sounds good, we'll just do that, and they've not really thought about what that looks like in practice. So lots to learn there, I think, for Glasgow so far. And I think leading quite nicely into the photo elicitation interviews, what actually is really important is citizen consultation and gaining the public support necessary for integrated public transport. So Angers in France was, use my pronunciation, probably a good example for public consultation of their light rail. And similarly in Vienna, they're very good at integrating kind of public and stakeholder involvement at all stages. So they've managed to make the public transport benefit not just the public, but also businesses because people can get to them, but also they've got more political support through their different parties. So got a wee bit of time to just give you a quick overview of the photo elicitation interviews as well. So we're aiming for 20 to 40. I've done 13 so far, where participants have been, it is optional, the photo-elicitation part, but they've been posted a digital camera with the instructions and a camera user guide to use for about 7 days to take photos of their daily travel. We've included those who we think may face more barriers, including older adults, given there's a range of different mobilities within that age group. We've also wanted to explore that in the interviews, but also people using prams, mental or physical health challenges. But we've also given a self-select option on the screening form so that anyone can add in their own that we haven't considered. And then just ethics of photo taking, I'll just skip through that, but essentially don't take photos of people's faces and things like that. So one common barrier that's come up so far, again, it's very early, is a lack of accessibility and the barrier to public transport use. So this is an example from a lady from the south of Glasgow who's over 60, and she talks about how her local train station doesn't have a lift and she has to use the railing to get down, and she says that she sees young people running down the steps to catch the train, but because she's a bit older and she has to hold on, she misses the train. Reliability has been one of the biggest things that's come up. It's come up in a positive way. For example, one young woman with autism said that she really liked the reliability of the subway and that she always knew when it was coming, and that was a very comforting and more relaxing experience for her than other modes of transport. But there's been a lot of negative comments, particularly about the bus and the bus's lack of reliability, or bus routes being reduced. So this person said that they actually used to go for a walk in their nearby village and they take the bus back, but if they're going to miss the bus, they're not going to go for that walk, and that's having a bigger impact not only on their fitness but also on the businesses in the local area that they maybe would have gone to had they had a more reliable service. And that's really common across demographics as well, as just reliability is a key issue. Infrastructure and a lack of safety has been a barrier to cycling. This is a car parked in the stop-start zone, which is the cycle box. And this was someone who's just said, it's not only that they're poorly maintained by the council, so people might not see them, but also some cars just make them an extension of the road. And that not only makes it unsafe, but it can also kind of create animosity between cyclists and drivers, and that creates all sorts of other issues. So that's really one of the biggest issues. He took about 4 photos of cars stopped in these zones. And finally, affordability as a facilitator and a barrier. Again, particularly the buses have been talked about. Actually, a lot of people don't use the train because it's very expensive. This is an example from a young woman who actually just turned 23, so she's just started paying for the bus, but she and her mum have no other mode of transport and they don't have any shops nearby, so it's actually a really big expense for them to get anywhere day to day for the about £6 per time. So overall, participants did respond positively to the idea of an integrated public transport system. We told them what the Clyde Metro would be, and they said, yeah, it sounds good. But many were just focused on improving the services that we actually have right now, specifically affordability, reliability, and accessibility. So the next stages will be to finalise all the findings, and we will prepare a report for the Clyde Metro team to inform their next steps of public consultation, which can maybe be a wee bit more specific than what we've been working through. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Maria. Do we have any questions still? I'll maybe start off if not. Oh, we got go ahead.
So I think the first stage they're going to do their own public consultation. So I think they're going to go to specific groups and explore the issues that come up more specifically. But also they're really interested in the cities from the rapid review so that they can do more research on the case studies. So again, it's a really small study. It's just kind of designed to help them, but I think it's going to be, they're still in their kind of funding, looking for funding period and looking for what routes will be. So I think it will help through that.
Claire, did you have a question on that?
Yes, I have a question. Thanks, Maria. That was really interesting. Before my question, on the cost part, really exciting for me this week that ScotRail abolished peak fares again, apparently permanently this time, because before they did a trial and it got cheaper for a while and then it got dearer, but now they've abolished them again. So hopefully that'll help more people to travel by train further, not just in Glasgow, but further in the country. Sorry, I'm spraffing. My question is, how do, you talked about the bike storage, which is really important. How do e-bikes have an impact on this? Because of course they're really good for people. Sorry, I've seen Sharon's comment. The e-bikes are really useful for people who are less able or older, but there seems to be difficulties with their safe storage. So is that a consideration as well?
The storage of e-bikes actually hasn't come up so far. It's an interesting point because I think some of the people who do cycle use the next e-bikes, and they find that they're fairly okay because you can just stop them, but then also they need repaired a lot. But it's not come up specifically so far, but that's definitely something I could explore more actually in the later interviews. But yeah, it's been interesting as well I've been going to people's homes like outside of Glasgow City to do this, so I've had to go on public transport a lot, and the peak rail fare has actually helped quite a lot, the reduction in it.
Any questions? Can I just ask one on so the literature from other countries and then the UK setting with all the privatised buses, which is quite unique, I think.
Yeah.
Was there anything that you had to think about there or that has come up so far there?
There is one case study that I've not gone through the whole way, but it talks about the full privatisation of the UK and why there's been a lot of setbacks. But I think we're looking more at like Edinburgh is a good example. They're also looking at Yorkshire as a good example. They've just completely finished their public consultation process. So I think there are good examples coming that they can kind of begin to work from, but I don't know specifics.
Yeah, go ahead.
On that point about cost, so how many of these European cities, like what was the kind of cost range and averaging? Because I've been in lots of European cities where it would be anything.
I don't think it's specifically come up how much it is, but I can look into it. But my colleagues are also doing a health economic evaluation, which might have brought out more of that stuff.
Perfect. Let's thank Maria. Thank you. Next up, we've got David.
Okay, thanks a lot. Just before I start and before Johnny starts the 12-minute clock, just 3 quick things to say by means of explanation and introduction. The first is this isn't really a proper project. This is just a kind of hobby that I've brought from my last job. And I was just kind of doing it around other things that are more important and much more time consuming that we all do in here in terms of, teaching and applying for money in the big one at the moment, moving office. So just bear that in mind when it comes to asking questions. The second thing is lifespan variation. It just sounds incredibly dull, but actually I think it is quite interesting in terms of what it shows. So that's why the subtitle at the top was, this is more interesting than it sounds. But it's also quite kind of complex in a bit. So there's one slide I'll have to ask you to focus, but I'll wait here at that point so you can do that. And the third thing is, although this was a kind of hobby down the back of a fag packet, more or less, I had lots of help from people on the bottom of the slide. And a particular shout out to Andy, who I think is online, who was really helpful with some of the analysis, and also who's also here. You can start your clock now. So the background to this lies with the fact that lots of governments and other institutions like universities often claim that they want to narrow health inequalities. To be absolutely clear in this very brief and quickly delivered presentation, when I'm talking about health inequalities today, I'm talking about socioeconomic inequalities in health, okay, so the gap across social groups between rich and poor, rather than other important forms of health inequality. So governments claim they want to narrow health inequalities. I think it's fair to say that over time, some governments have been more serious than others. So the Attlee government in the UK in the post-war era was very, very serious about narrowing inequalities. More recent UK governments, not so much. In Scotland, the Scottish government has always talked a very, very good game about narrowing health inequalities, but actually whether it has the appropriate powers to do so is highly, highly questionable. But that's perhaps a talk for another day. But in any case, assuming they're serious about wanting to narrow health inequalities, then governments obviously have to know how inequalities in their own country compare with elsewhere. But that's actually quite a difficult thing to do, and it's a surprisingly difficult thing to do for really tedious reasons of data. So to compare health inequalities across countries, you obviously need comparable information on health, and that's okay because you can use things like mortality or life expectancy or whatever. But you also need that broken down or available by comparable socioeconomic indicators, so income or social class or deprivation. And the problem obviously is that these things are often recorded differently in different countries, or indeed not recorded at all. So comparisons are either difficult or actually impossible. Educational attainment is the most commonly used variable for this comparative purpose. But if you look in the literature, there's lots and lots of documented problems with it in terms of how really comparable it is across different types of society, different education systems and over time. So it's actually quite problematic. Also, because of that problematic aspect of it, the kind of data are kind of updated very infrequently and they become frequently out of date as they are at the moment. And also Scotland is often not included in some of the European comparisons because we are not deemed to be a country, male freedom and all that. So a potential solution is to use a measure called lifespan variation as a proxy for socioeconomic inequalities and mortality. As the name suggests, it measures how much lifespan varies across the population, how much death varies by age in the population. The strongest argument for it, I think, lies with all the evidence, arguably centuries worth rather than decades worth, that the fundamental causes of health inequalities are socioeconomic, and therefore any variation in lifespan is likely to be largely driven by socioeconomic conditions experienced over the life course, and we all know this kind of stuff. And it's backed up by the literature, which shows lifespan variation is particularly influenced by early death, which is, of course, much more common, tragically, among poorer and more disadvantaged groups. And therefore, there's also a lot of evidence in the literature linking lifespan variation to poverty, lower SDP, deprivation, etc. Other benefits are that it can be calculated very easily from routine mortality data without the need for complex socioeconomic measures. And so you can do that for Scotland, freedom again. And also because of that, it can be updated very, very, very quickly. So the aim of this project, come scribble in the back of a fact packet, was to try and look at what lifespan variation trends showed for Scotland compared to other European countries. I did it for all European countries, but I'm just going to talk about Western Europe today. Then to assess what those trends showed in relation to what we already know about inequalities in Scotland and the UK as a kind of informal evaluation, if you like, and then to go one step more and do a more explicit comparison, comparing lifespan variation with a more bona fide measure of socioeconomic inequality in mortality within just Scotland. The methods could go on forever, so I'm just going to reduce them to 4 bullet points. We were using data from the Human Mortality Database, which you may or may not know, but it has very detailed information on deaths across a lot of countries over the years. There are different measures of lifespan variation. We were using a measure called, excitingly and sexily, E-Dagger. Who says statisticians don't have a sense of adventure? And we were using this measure to compare Scotland with other European countries over a very long time period, so 150 years. This is why I think it gets quite interesting. Principally up to pre-COVID, but we also did some specific COVID comparisons. And then for within the within Scotland comparisons, we were comparing this measure with a measure of absolute socioeconomic inequality in mortality and also life expectancy for the 32 local authority areas. For the statos who want details, that was using the slope index of inequality, using data on level, group and deciles within local authority areas. For the non-statos, I'll just stop there. So worth just saying that it's looking at an absolute measure of inequality because apparently this measure of lifespan variation, that's more relevant for that. So, well, that's quite rushed, but it's a lot of stuff to get through. So, what does it all show? This is long-term trends for males. So this goes all the way back through the middle of the 19th century. This is when a lot of infectious diseases, children up chimneys and all the rest of it. So very high child mortality rates, infant mortality rates, so therefore lifespan variation is very, very big. As living conditions and other things improve, this reduces all across these 20 different European countries. And that's also true of Scotland, which is highlighted there in blue. But where it gets kind of interesting, I think, is once you get to the 1980s, then Scotland completely bucks that downward trend, with lifespan variation stopping going down and actually starting to increase in the 80s into the early 2000s. It comes down again, but then increases sharply from the early 2010s. In England and Wales, shown here in black, it's similar but not quite so extreme, but things do worsen in a kind of relative sense. So at the start of the 1980s or so, it was about the second best. By the end of the period, it was about the seventh worst. And if you take a snapshot of that most recent period, 2017 to 2019, then Scotland has the highest, but it's notable that Northern Ireland and England and Wales are all at that kind of higher level, but a higher end of the spectrum. For females, it's kind of similar than different, but different. It's similar in the sense that Scotland stands out again, but it's been in that position for a much longer time period. In England and Wales, it's also similar, but again, but not quite so extreme. And notable again, when you look at that most recent time period, that all the UK nations have the highest levels of lifespan variation, this form of inequality. So how does this compare with what we know about inequalities in Scotland and the UK? And this is the bit we have to concentrate hard on. So there's lots of things in support of this being a decent proxy. So that increase in male lifespan variation in the 80s up to the 2000s that we saw there, you do see, if you look at analysis of absolute inequalities and mortality, in a very similar way. So an increase over that period followed by a slight decline, flatter in England, and that's also what we saw in the lifespan variation chart. The most recent increase in the early 2010s reflects a massive widening of inequalities that we've seen across the UK that have been largely attributed to UK government austerity measures, which have had a calamitous impact on the poorest in society. If you want more information on that, I recommend this absolutely amazing book, which is still available in all good bookshops at a very good price. I haven't shown you this, but we also showed increases in lifespan variation in one of the peak COVID years compared to pre-COVID, especially again in the UK areas. And that again reflects what we know about COVID in terms of health inequalities having widened massively. The different, i.e. worse trends in Scotland for males versus females is pretty consistent with what we know about higher rates of premature mortality and wider mortality inequalities in those periods. And that's driven again by higher deaths from alcohol, suicide, and of course the drugs death crisis. And there's been lots and lots of research from ourselves and other people on that topic. The generally higher lifespan variation for all the UK nations, especially for females, but also to a degree for males, arguably just reflects the fact that the UK is one of the most unequal societies in Western Europe. If you want to look at different measures like income inequality, then the UK or here Great Britain just stands above other Western European countries. And obviously you can argue that health inequality is an extension of broader societal inequalities. The worse or greater lifespan variation in Scotland compared to England, despite those similar economic exposures, if you like, is probably best explained by all the work we've done previously around higher levels of excess mortality and wider mortality inequalities in Scotland compared to England, driven by a whole set of historical factors, including worse living conditions and poor political decision making. And lastly, the comparisons with other published European data are broadly supportive, including the fact that Scotland always comes out in the worst position. Broadly supportive. What's not in support is it doesn't always tell the same story. So you would kind of expect lifespan variation among females to have increased over those 2 decades, because that's what other indicators show, and we didn't really see that. You might generally just have expected greater increases in lifespan variation, because we've seen that for different measures of inequality historically. For example, these historical analysis, but this is a kind of relative measure, and it's also area based, so it's difficult to kind of compare these things. There are, I said that the comparison with some of the published European data is pretty good, but it's not entirely consistent. It kind of changes and varies a little bit. And lastly, the final set of results in terms of the within Scotland comparisons beg quite a few questions. So I'll just finish with this. So this, as I said, was comparing lifespan variation on the bottom here with this measure of absolute inequalities and mortality. I'm going to plot the 32 local authority areas. If there was a very strong correspondence between the two, you'd obviously expect to see them along a nice straight line. what you get is a large number of them along a nice straight line. So in North Ayrshire, for example, it's got high levels of lifespan variation and correspondingly high levels of socioeconomic inequalities and mortality. But there's also lots and lots of outliers, which beg a lot of questions. And obviously, if this was a lovely relationship and with a very high number, like 1.57, isn't particularly great. That said, this other measure of mortality inequalities is based on area deprivation. There's lots of problems with area deprivation measures, including the fact that most deprived individuals don't live in the most deprived areas, etc., as you all know. So whether this is an issue of lifespan variation or an issue of the other measures of how we measure inequality, it's unclear, or perhaps a bit of both. So, in a ludicrously rapid run through this back analysis, what do you conclude? Well, in the absence of robust, up-to-date, comparable measures across countries, lifespan variation might be a kind of useful proxy. But there's lots of caution required because there's lots of things that need unpicked. And I hate presentations that end with more research required. But because I was doing it in the back of fact, it needs a lot more detailed work. And if you want to end on a less tentative note, is that it doesn't really matter how you measure it, but Scotland has wide and very, very widening health inequalities. So different policies, particularly at UK government level, desperately required. And I'll finish there, but if you've got any technical questions, I'll ask Ruth to answer. Thanks a lot.
Excellent, really interesting. Yeah, questions?
This is the graph. Okay, look, I suppose like a sort of urban rural divide, is that basically because that area definition measure?
Yeah. So it was just here. Yeah, no. So when we were writing this up, there you go. So the ones that are kind of like outliers tend to be more rural. So it does beg questions about that. But I think there's just questions everywhere, Tony. There's questions about that. There's questions about lifespan variation. There's questions about the whole kind of absolutely relative inequalities because they show different things and that kind of stuff. So I think you would need quite a detailed project to try and pick all this out, or maybe an MPH project.
Hamish.
Thanks very much. The lifespan variation measure that you wanted to go with a bit more about that and why you went with that as opposed to another one on that. I'm trying to imagine how you measure variation.
Yeah, no, I can't say any more about that. So Andy's in the call. He might. So there are. So we did look at the literature. Obviously, there are different measures available. This is what I can see the most commonly used one. So a value of whatever it is, I think I'm showing the other graphs, a value of 14 is a kind of summary measure of, you know, a kind of years of life lost type average type thing, but taken from that variation across the whole kind of population. I couldn't give you a good answer about what other measures would show, but this seemed to be the kind of most commonly used and the kind of best one. And if you look at literature, it features in a lot of publications about it. If Andy's online, he might have a more technical answer.
Not like disability adjusted like
If they don't have those data, so it's just looking at it's purely from death data.
Yeah.
So it's just the age of death, effectively, do that.
Andy, did you want to come in? I can see your hand up.
Yes, hello. So just a quick interpretation, or actually a question. Can you hear me? Because I'm like in a hotel room with.
Yeah.
So lifespan variation is basically a measure of the life table age at death distribution. So we have cross-sectional mortality rates. We apply them to random, let's say 1,000 people who are born today, and then we have basically their mortality trajectory over time. And lifespan variation tells us on average how many years too early or too late people would die. So it's a hypothetical measure. It's not anyone's lifespan variation, really. It's like a actuarial demographical measure. And it is subject to both ends of an age at death distribution. So at the premature mortality, but also old age mortality. So this is what makes it tricky. So if mortality improves at older ages, but not at younger ages, it will increase. If mortality does not improve at older ages, but it improves at younger ages, it will decrease. So it's quite tricky, but as David has shown, it might provide a proxy, but again, more research is probably required here. So.
Can I ask, just following up on that, coming back to your kind of premise on linking it to the fundamental causes in the theory, which I think makes sense. But is there, given that explanation of Andy especially, is there an age range that you'd expect that to be the strongest correlation potentially? Just thinking about like competing risks and things.
So I think part of the things that you need to unpick is like the impact of, for example, infant deaths, so very early death. I think it would be a proper project where you basically do that and you go through all the kind of different age groups, childhood, working age and all the rest, and figure out how in those areas it best compares. As I said, I was doing this for another thing, so it's not enough time to do it. But I think, I think that there's potential to look at that in a lot of.
Any other questions? No. Perfect. Any online before we go? Last chance. Go. Let's go for Claire. Thanks very much, David. Claire's